CHAPTER IX of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. The Toilet. The condemned cell of Bicêtre was situated at the end of a gloomy passage, into which a trifling portion of light and air was admitted by means of small gratings let into the lower part of the wall. The cell itself would have been wholly dark but for a kind of wicket, let into the upper part of the door, which opened into the corridor before mentioned. In this wretched dungeon, whose crumbling ceiling, damp, mouldy walls, and stone-paved floors struck a death chill like that of the grave, were confined the widow Martial and her daughter Calabash. The harsh, angular features of the widow stood out amidst the imperfect light of the place, cold, pale, and immovable as those of a marble statue. Deprived of the use of her hands, which were fastened beneath her black dress by the strait waistcoat of the prison, formed of a coarse gray cloth and tightly secured behind her, she requested her cap be taken off, complaining of an oppression and burning sensation in her head. This done, a mass of long, grizzled hair fell over her shoulders. Seated on the side of her bed, she gazed earnestly and fixedly at her daughter, who was separated from her by the width of the dungeon, and, wearing like her mother the customary strait waistcoat, was partly reclining and partly supporting herself against the wall, her head bent forward on her breast, her eye dull and motionless, and her breathing quick and irregular. From time to time a convulsive tremor rattled her lower jaw, while her features, spite of their livid hue, remained comparatively calm and tranquil. Within the cell, and immediately beneath the wicket of the entrance door, was seated an old, gray-headed soldier, whose rough, sunburnt features betokened his having felt the scorch of many climes, and borne his part in numerous campaigns. His duty was to keep constant watch over the condemned prisoners. "How piercing cold it is here!" exclaimed Calabash; "yet my eyes burn in my head, and I have a burning, quenchless thirst." Then, addressing the bald-headed veteran, she said, "Water! Pray give me a drink of water." The old soldier filled a cup of water from a pitcher placed near him, and held it to her lips. Eagerly swallowing the draught, she bowed her head in token of thankfulness, and the soldier proceeded to offer the same beverage to the mother. "Would you not like to moisten your lips?" asked he, kindly. With a rough, repulsive gesture, she intimated her disinclination, and the old man sat down again. "What's o'clock?" inquired Calabash. "Nearly half past 4," replied the soldier. "Only 3 hours," replied Calabash, with a sinister and gloomy smile. "3 hours more, and then " She could proceed no further. The widow shrugged up her shoulders. Her daughter divined her meaning, and said: "Ah, mother, you have so much more courage than I have; you never give way, you don't." "Never." "I see it, and I know you too well to expect it. You look at this moment as calm and collected as if we were sitting sewing by our own fireside. Ah, those happy days are gone, gone for ever!" "Folly! Why prate thus?" "Nay, mother, I cannot bear to rest shut up with my own wretched thoughts. It relieves my heart to talk of bygone times, when I little expected to come to this." "Mean, cowardly creature!" "I know I am a coward, mother. I am afraid to die. Every one cannot boast of your resolution. I do not possess it. I have tried as much as I could to imitate you. I refused to listen to the priest because you did not like it. Still, I may have been wrong in sending the holy man away. For," added the wretched creature, with a shudder, "who can tell what is after death? Mother, do you hear me? After, I say; and it only wants exactly 3 hours, and you will know all about it." "How can you speak so indifferently on such a dreadful subject?" "Yet true enough. In 3 short hours, we who now sit talking to each other, who, if at liberty, should ail nothing, but be ready to enjoy life, must die. Oh, mother, can you not say one word to comfort me? Be bold, girl, and die as you have lived, a true Martial." "You should not talk thus to your daughter," interposed the old soldier, with a serious air. "You would have acted more like a parent had you allowed her to listen to the priest when he came." Again the widow contemptuously shrugged her shoulders, and, without deigning to notice the soldier further than by bestowing on him a look of withering contempt, She repeated to Calabash: "Pluck up your courage, my girl, and let the world see that women have more courage than men, with their priests and cowardly nonsense. General Leblond was one of the bravest officers of the regiment he belonged to. Well, this dauntless man fell at the siege of Saragossa, covered with wounds, and his last expiring act was to sign himself with the cross," said the veteran. "I served under him. I only tell you this to prove that to die with a prayer on your lips is no sign of cowardice." Calabash eyed the bronzed features of the speaker with deep attention. The scarred and weather–beaten countenance of the old man told of a life passed in scenes of danger and of death, encountered with calm bravery. To hear those wrinkled lips urging the necessity of prayer, and associating religion with the memory of the good and valiant, made the miserable, vacillating culprit think that, after all, there could be no cowardice in recommending one's soul to the God who gave it, and breathing a repentant supplication for the past. "Alas! Alas!" cried she, "why did I not attend to what the priest had to say to me? It could not have done me any harm, and it might have given me courage to face that dreadful afterwards, that makes death so terrible." "What, again?" exclaimed the widow, with bitter contempt. "'Tis a pity time does not permit of your becoming a nun. The arrival of your brother Martial will complete your conversion; but that honest man and excellent son will think it sinful to come and receive the last wishes of his dying mother." As the widow uttered these last words, the huge lock of the prison was heard to turn with a loud sound, and then the door to open. "So soon!" shrieked Calabash, with a convulsive bound. "Surely the time here is wrong; it cannot be the hour we were told. Oh, mother, mother! Must we die at least 2 hours before we expected?" "So much the better, if the executioner's watch deceives me. It will put an end to your whining folly, which disgraces the name you bear." "Madame," said an officer of the prison, gently opening the door, "your son is here. Will you see him?" "Yes," replied the widow, without turning her head. Martial entered the cell, the door of which was left open, that those without in the corridor might be within hearing, if summoned by the old soldier, who still remained with the prisoners. Through the gloom of the corridor, lighted only by the faint beams of the early morning, and the dubious twinkling of a single lamp, several soldiers and gaolers might be seen, the former standing in due military order, the latter sitting on benches. Martial looked as pale and ghastly as his mother, while his features betrayed the mental agony he suffered at witnessing so afflicting a sight. Still, spite of all it cost him, as well as the recollection of his mother's crimes and openly expressed aversion for himself, he had felt it imperatively his duty to come and receive her last commands. No sooner was he in the dungeon than the widow, fixing on him a sharp, penetrating look, said in a tone of concentrated wrath and bitterness, with a view to rouse all the evil passions of her son's mind: "Well, you see what the good people are going to do with your mother and sister." "Ah, mother, how dreadful! Alas, alas! Have I not warned you that such would be the end?" Interrupting him, while her lips became blanched with rage, the widow exclaimed: "Enough! 'Tis sufficient that your mother and sister are about to be murdered, as your father was." "Merciful God!" cried Martial; "and to think that I have no power to prevent it! 'Tis past all human interference. What would you have me do? Alas! Had you or my sister attended to what I said, you would not now have been here." "Oh, no doubt," returned the widow, with her usual tone of savage irony. "To you the spectacle of mine and your sister's sufferings is a matter of delight to your proud heart. You can now tell the world without a lie that your mother is dead. You will have to blush for her no more." "Had I been wanting in my duty as a son," answered Martial, indignant at the unjust sarcasms of his mother, "I should not now be here." "You came but from curiosity. Own the truth, if you dare." "No, mother; you desired to see me, and I obeyed your wish." "Ah, Martial!" cried Calabash, unable longer to struggle against the agonising terror she endured, "had I but listened to your advice, instead of being led by my mother, I should not be here." Then, losing all further control of herself, she exclaimed: 'Tis all your fault, accursed mother! Your bad example and evil counsel have brought me to what I am." "Do you hear her?" said the widow, bursting into a fiendish laugh. "Come, this will repay you for the trouble of paying us a last visit. Your excellent sister has turned pious, repents of her own sins, and curses her mother." Without making any reply to this unnatural speech, Martial approached Calabash, whose dying agonies seemed to have commenced, and, regarding her with deep compassion, said: "My poor sister! Alas, it is now too late to recall the past." "It is never too late to turn coward, it seems!" cried the widow, with savage excitement. "Oh, what a race you are! Happily Nicholas has escaped. François and Amandine will slip through your fingers. They have already imbibed vice enough, and want and misery will finish them." "Oh, Martial!" groaned forth Calabash, "for the love of God, take care of those two poor children, lest they come to such an end as mother's and mine." "He may watch over them as much as he likes," cried the widow, with settled hatred in her looks. "Vice and destitution will have greater effect than his words, and some of these days they will avenge their father, mother, and sister." "Your horrible expectations, mother, will never be fulfilled," replied the indignant Martial. "Neither my young brother, sister, nor self have anything to fear from want. La Louve saved the life of the young girl Nicholas tried to drown, and the relations of the young person offered us either a large sum of money or a smaller sum in some land at Algiers. We preferred the latter, and to morrow we quit Europe, with the children, for ever." "Is that absolutely true?" asked the widow of Martial, in a tone of angry surprise. "Mother, when did I ever tell you a falsehood?" "You are doing so now to try and put me into a passion." "What, displeased to learn that your children are provided for?" "Yes, to find that my young wolves are to be turned into lambs, and to hear that the blood of father, mother, and sister have no prospect of being avenged." "Do not talk so, at a moment like this." "I have murdered and am murdered in my turn; the account is even, at any rate." "Mother, mother, let me beseech you to repent ere you die." Again a peal of fiendish laughter burst from the pallid lips of the condemned woman. "For 30 years," cried she, "have I lived in crime. Would you have me believe that 30 years' guilt is to be repented of in 3 days, with the mind disturbed and distracted by the near approach of death? No, no, 3 days cannot effect such wonders; and I tell you, when my head falls its last expression will be rage and hatred." "Brother, brother!" ejaculated Calabash, whose brain began to wander. "Help, help! Take me from hence!" moaned she, in an expiring voice. "They are coming to fetch me, to kill me! Oh, hide me, dear brother, hide me, and I will love you evermore!" "Will you hold your tongue?" cried the widow, exasperated at the weakness betrayed by her daughter. "Will you be silent? Oh, you base, you disgraceful creature! And to think that I should be obliged to call myself your parent!" "Mother," exclaimed Martial, nearly distracted by this horrid scene, "will you tell me why you sent for me?" "Because I thought to give you heart and hatred; but he who has not the one cannot entertain the other. Go, coward, go!" At this moment a loud sound of many footsteps was heard in the corridor. The old soldier looked at his watch. A rich ray of the golden brightness which marked the rising of that day's sun found its way through the loopholes in the walls and shed a flood of light into the very midst of the wretched cell, rendered now completely illumined by means of the opening of the door at the opposite end of the passage to that in which the condemned cell was situated. In the midst of this blaze of day appeared 2 gaolers, each bearing a chair. An officer also made his appearance, saying to the widow, in a voice of sympathy, "Madame, the hour has arrived." The mother arose on the instant, erect and immovable, while Calabash uttered the most piercing cries. Then 4 more persons entered the cell, Four of the number, who were very shabbily dressed, bore in their hands packets of fine but very strong cord. The taller man of the party was dressed in black, with a large cravat. He handed a paper to the officer. This individual was the executioner, and the paper a receipt signifying his having received 2 females for the purpose of guillotining them. The man then took sole charge of these unhappy creatures, and from that moment was responsible for them. To the wild terror and despair which had first seized Calabash, now succeeded a kind of stupefaction, and so nearly insensible was she that the assistant executioners were compelled to seat her on her bed, and to support her when there. Her firmly closed jaws scarcely enabled her to utter a sound, but her hollow eyes rolled vacantly in their sockets, her chin fell listlessly on her breast, and but for the support of the 2 men, she would have fallen forwards a lifeless, senseless mass. After having bestowed a last embrace on his wretched sister, Martial stood petrified with terror, unable to speak or move, and as though perfectly spellbound by the horrible scene before him. The cool audacity of the widow did not for an instant forsake her. With head erect and firm, collected manner, she assisted in taking off the strait waistcoat she had worn, and which had hitherto fettered her movements. This removed, she appeared in an old black stuff dress. "Where shall I place myself?" asked she, in a clear, steady voice. "Be good enough to sit down upon one of those chairs," said the executioner, pointing to the seats arranged at the entrance of the dungeon. With unfaltering step, the widow prepared to follow the directions given her, but as she passed her daughter, she said, in a voice that betokened some little emotion, "Kiss me, my child." But as the sound of her mother's voice reached her ear, Calabash seemed suddenly to wake up from her lethargy, she raised her head, and, with a wild and almost frenzied cry, exclaimed, "Away! Leave me! And if there be a hell, may it receive you!" "My child," repeated the widow, "let us embrace for the last time." "Do not approach me!" cried the distracted girl, violently repulsing her mother. "You have been my ruin in this world and the next." "Then forgive me ere I die." "Never, never!" exclaimed Calabash; and then, totally exhausted by the effort she had made, she sank back in the arms of the assistants. A cloud passed over the hitherto stern features of the widow, and a moisture was momentarily visible on her glowing eyeballs. At this instant she encountered the pitying looks of her son. After a trifling hesitation, during which she seemed to be undergoing some powerful internal conflict, she said, "And you?" Sobbing violently, Martial threw himself into his mother's arms. "Enough!" said the widow, conquering her emotion, and withdrawing herself from the close embrace of her son. "I am keeping this gentleman waiting," pointing to the executioner. Then, hurrying towards a chair, she resolutely seated herself, and the gleam of maternal sensibility she had exhibited was for ever extinguished. "Do not stay here," said the old soldier, approaching Martial with an air of kindness. "Come this way," continued he, leading him, while Martial, stupefied by horror, followed him mechanically. The almost expiring Calabash, having been supported to a chair by the 2 assistants, one sustained her all but inanimate form, while the other tied her hands behind with fine but excessively strong whipcord, knotted into the most inextricable meshes, while with a cord of the same description he secured her feet, allowing her just so much liberty as would enable her to proceed slowly to her last destination. The widow having borne a similar pinioning with the most imperturbable composure, the executioner, drawing from his pocket a pair of huge scissors, said to her with considerable civility, "Be good enough to stoop your head, madame." Yielding immediate obedience to the request, the widow said, "We have been good customers to you. You have had my husband in your hands, and now you have his wife and daughter." Without making any reply, the executioner began to cut the long gray hairs of the prisoner very close, especially at the nape of the neck. "This makes the 3rd time in my life," continued the widow, with a dismal smile, "that I have had my head dressed by a professor. When I took my first communion the white veil was arranged; then on my marriage,
when the orange flowers were placed there; and upon the present occasion, upon my word, I hardly know which became me most. You cannot guess what I am thinking of?" resumed the widow, addressing the executioner, after having again contemplated her daughter. But the man made her no sort of answer, and no sound was heard but that of the scissors and the sort of convulsive and hysterical sob that occasionally escaped from Calabash. At this moment a venerable priest approached the governor, and addressed him in a low, earnest voice, the import of which was to express his desire to make an effort to rescue the souls of the condemned. "I was thinking that at 5 years old my daughter, whose head you are going to cut off, was the prettiest child I ever saw, with her fair hair and red cheeks. Who that saw her then would have said that—" She was silent for a moment, and then said, with a burst of indescribable laughter, "What a farce is destiny!" At this moment the last of her hair was cut off. "I have done, madame," said the executioner, politely. "Many thanks, and I recommend my son Nicholas to you," said the widow. "You will cut off his hair some day." A turnkey came in and said a few words to her in a low tone. "No, I have already said no," she answered, angrily. The priest, hearing these words, and seeing any further interference useless, immediately withdrew. "Madame, we are all ready to go. Will you take anything?" inquired the executioner, civilly. "No, I thank you. This evening I shall take a mouthful of earth." And after this remark, the widow rose firmly. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a rope was also attached to each ankle, allowing her sufficient liberty to walk. Although her step was firm and resolute, the executioner and his assistant offered to support her; but she turned to them disdainfully, and said, "Do not touch me. I have a steady eye and a firm foot, and they will hear on the scaffold whether or not I have a good voice." Calabash was carried away in a dying state. After having traversed the long corridor, the funereal cortège ascended a stone staircase which led to an exterior court, where was a picket of gendarmes, a hackney coach, and a long, narrow carriage with a yellow body, drawn by 3 post horses, who were neighing loudly. "We shall not be full inside," said the widow, as she took her seat. The 2 vehicles, preceded and followed by the picket of gendarmes, then quitted the outer gate of Bicêtre, and went quickly towards the Boulevard St. Jacques. CHAPTER X. Of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This recording is in the public domain. Martial and the Chourineur. Before we proceed, we have a few words to say as to the acquaintance recently established between the Chourineur and Martial. When Germain had left the prison, the Chourineur proved very easily that he had robbed himself, and, making a statement of his motive for his singular mystification to the magistrate, he was set at liberty, after having been severely admonished. Desirous of recompensing the Chourineur for this fresh act of devotion, Rodolph, in order to realise the wishes of his rough protégé, had lodged him in the hôtel of the Rue Plumet, promising that he should accompany him on his return to Germany. The Chourineur's blind attachment to Rodolph was like that of a dog for his master. When, however, the prince had found his daughter, all was changed, and, in spite of his warm gratitude for the man who had saved his life, he could not make up his mind to take with him to Germany the witness of Fleur de Marie's fallen state. Yet, determined to carry out the Chourineur's wishes, he sent for him, and told him that he had still another service to ask of him. At this the Chourineur's countenance brightened up; but he was greatly distressed when he learned that he must quit the hôtel that very day, and would not accompany the prince to Germany. It is useless to mention the munificent compensations which Rodolph offered to the Chourineur, the money he intended for him, the farm in Algeria, anything he could desire. The Chourineur was wounded to the heart, refused, and, perhaps for the first time in his life, wept. Rodolph was compelled to force his presence on him. Next day the prince sent for La Louve and Martial, and inquired what he could do for them. Remembering what Fleur de Marie had told him of the wild taste of La Louve and her husband,
He proposed to the hardy couple either a considerable sum of money, or half the sum, and land in full cultivation adjoining the farm he had bought for the Chourineur, believing that by bringing them together they would sympathise, from their desire to seek solitude, the one in consequence of the past, and the other from the crimes of his family. He was not mistaken. Martial and La Louve accepted joyfully; and then, talking the matter over with the Chourineur, they all rejoiced in the prospects held out to them in Algeria. A sincere good feeling soon united the future colonists. Persons of their class judge quickly of each other, and like one another as speedily. The Chourineur accompanied his new friend Martial to the Bicêtre, and awaited him in the hackney coach which conducted them back to Paris, after Martial, horror struck, had left the dungeon of his mother and sister. The countenance of the Chourineur had completely changed. The bold expression and jovial humour which usually characterised his harsh features had given way to extreme dejection. His voice had lost something of its coarseness; a grief of heart, until then unknown to him, had broken down his energetic temperament. He looked kindly at Martial, and said: "Courage! You have done all that good intentions could do; it is ended. Think now of your wife, and the children whom you have prevented from becoming criminals like their father and mother. To night we leave Paris never to return to it, and you will never again hear of what so much distresses you now." "True, true; but, after all, they are my sister and mother." "Yes, but when things must be, we must submit," said the Chourineur, checking a deep sigh. After a moment's silence, Martial said kindly: "And I ought in my turn to try and console you who are so sad. My wife and I hope that when we have left Paris this will cease." "Yes," said the Chourineur, with a shudder, "if I leave Paris." "Why, we go this evening." "Yes, you do; you go this evening." "And have you changed your intention, then?" "No, yet, Martial, you'll laugh at me; but yet I will tell you all. If anything happens to me it will prove that I am not deceived. When M. Rodolph asked if we could go to Algeria together, I told you my mind at once, and also what I had been." "Yes, you did. Let us mention it no more. You underwent your punishment, and are now as good as any one. But, like myself, I can imagine you would like to go and live a long way off, instead of living here, where, however honest we may be, they might at times fling in your teeth a misdeed you have atoned for and repented, and in mine my parents' crimes, for which I am by no means responsible. The past is the past between us, and we shall never reproach each other." "With you and me, Martial, the past is the past; but you see, Martial, there is something above. I have killed a man." "A great misfortune, assuredly; but at the moment you were out of your senses, mad. And, besides, you have since saved the lives of other persons, and that will count in your favour. I'll tell you why I refer to my misdeed. I used to have a dream, in which I saw the sergeant I killed. I have not had it for a long time until last night, and that foretells some misfortune for to day. I have a foreboding that I shall not quit Paris." "Oh, you regret at leaving our benefactor. The thought of coming with me to the Bicêtre agitated you, and so your dream recurred to you." The Chourineur shook his head sorrowfully, and said: "It has come to me just as M. Rodolph is going to start, for he goes to day. Yesterday I sent a messenger to his hôtel, not daring to go myself. They sent me word that he went this morning at 11 o'clock by the barrier of Charenton, and I mean to go and station myself there to try and see him once more, for the last time. He seems so good that I easily understand your love for him." "Love for him!" said the Chourineur, with deep and concentrated emotion. "Yes, yes, Martial. To lie on the earth, eat black bread, be his dog, to be where he was, I asked no more. But that was too much; he would not consent. He has been very generous towards you. Yet it is not for that I love him, but because he told me I had heart and honour. Yes, and that at a time when I was as fierce as a brute beast. And he made me understand what was good in me, and that I had repented, and, after suffering a great misery, had worked hard for an honest livelihood, although all the world considered me as a thorough ruffian,
And so, when M. Rodolph said these words to me, my heart beat high and proudly, and from this time I would go through fire and water to serve him." "Why, it is because you are better than you were that you ought not to have any of those forebodings. Your dream is nothing." "We shall see. I shall not try and get into any mischief, for I cannot have any worse misfortune than not to see again M. Rodolph, whom I hope never again to leave. I should have been in my way, you see, always with him, body and soul, always ready. Never mind, perhaps he was wrong. I am only a worm at his feet. But sometimes, Martial, the smallest may be useful to the greatest. One day, perhaps, you may see him." "Oh, no! He said to me, 'My good fellow, you must promise never to seek nor see me; that will be doing me a service.' So, of course, Martial, I promised; and I'll keep my word, though it is very hard. Once at Algeria, you will forget all your vexations." "Yes, yes, I'm an old trooper, Martial, and will face the Bedouins." "Come, come, you'll soon recover your spirits. We'll farm and hunt together, and live together, or separate, just as you like. We'll bring up the children like honest people, and you shall be their uncle; for we are brothers, and my wife is good at heart. And so we'll be happy, eh?" And Martial extended his hand to the Chourineur. "So we will, Martial," was the reply; "and my sorrow will kill me, or I shall kill my sorrow." "It will not kill you. We shall pass our days together; and every evening we will say, 'Brother, thanks to M. Rodolph.' That shall be our prayer to him." "Martial, you comfort me." "Well, then, that is all right; and as to that stupid dream, you will think no more of it, I hope?" "I'll try." "Well, then, you'll come to us at 4 o'clock. The diligence goes at 5." "Agreed. But I will get out here and walk to the barrier at Charenton, where I will await M. Rodolph, that I may see him pass." The coach stopped, and the Chourineur alighted. CHAPTer X. Read by Céline Major. Chapter XI of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This recording is in the public domain. The Finger of Providence. The Chourineur had forgotten that it was the day after Mid Lent, and was consequently greatly surprised at the sight, at once hideous and singular, which presented itself to his view when he arrived at the exterior boulevard, which he was traversing to reach the barrier of Charenton. He found himself suddenly in the thickest of a dense throng of people, who were coming out of the cabaret of the Faubourg de la Glacière, in order to reach the Boulevard St. Jacques, where the execution was to take place. Although it was broad daylight, there was still heard the noisy music of the public houses, whence issued particularly the loud echoes of the cornet à piston. The pencil of Callot, of Rembrandt, or of Goya, is requisite to limn the strange, hideous, and fantastical appearance of this multitude. Almost all of them, men, women, and children, were attired in old masquerade costumes. Those who could not afford this expense had on their clothes rags of bright colours. Some young men were dressed in women's clothes, half torn and soiled with mud. All their countenances, haggard from debauchery and vice, and furrowed by intoxication, sparkled with savage delight at the idea that, after a night of filthy orgies, they should see two women executed on the scaffold prepared for them. The foul and fetid scum of the population of Paris, this vast mob, was formed of thieves and abandoned women, who every day tax crime for their daily bread, and every evening return to their lairs with their vicious spoils. Note 1. It is calculated that there are in Paris 30,000 persons who have no other means of existence but theft. The crowd entirely choked up the means of circulation, and, in spite of his gigantic strength, the Chourineur was compelled to remain almost motionless in the midst of this compact throng. He was, however, willing to remain so, as the prince would not pass the barrier of Charenton until 11 o'clock, and it was not yet 7, and he had a singular spectacle before him. In a large, low apartment, occupied at one end by musicians, surrounded by benches and tables laden with the fragments of a repast, broken plates, empty bottles, etc.,
A dozen men and women, in various disguises and half drunk, were dancing with the utmost excitement that frantic and obscene dance called la chahut. Amongst the dissipated revellers who figured in this saturnalia, the Chourineur remarked two couples who obtained the most overwhelming applause, from the revolting grossness of their attitudes, their gesticulations, and their language. The first couple consisted of a man disguised as a bear, and nearly covered with a waistcoat and trousers of black sheepskin. The head of the animal, being too troublesome to carry, had been replaced by a kind of hood with long hair, which entirely covered his features; two holes for his eyes, and a long one for his mouth allowed him to see, speak, and breathe. This man, one of the prisoners escaped from La Force, amongst whom were Barbillon and the two murderers arrested at the ogress's at the tapis franc at the beginning of this recital, this man so masked was Nicholas Martial, the son and brother of the two women for whom the scaffold was prepared but a few paces distant. Induced into this act of atrocious insensibility and infamous audacity by one of his associates, this wretch had dared with this disguise to join in the last revels of the carnival. The woman who danced with him, dressed as a vivandière, wore a round leather cap with ragged ribbons, a kind of bodice of threadbare red cloth, ornamented with 3 rows of brass buttons, a green skirt, and trousers of white calico. Her black hair fell in disorder all about her head, and her haggard and swollen features evinced the utmost effrontery and immodesty. The vis-à-vis of these dancers were no less disgusting. The man, who was very tall, and disguised as Robert Macaire, had so begrimed his features with soot that it was impossible to recognise him, and besides a large bandage covered his left eye. The white of the right eye, being thus the more heightened, rendered him still more hideous. The lower part of the Skeleton's countenance, for it was he, disappeared in a high neckcloth made of an old red shawl. Wearing an old, white, napless hat with a crushed side, dirty and without a crown, a green coat in rags, and tight mulberry-coloured pantaloons, patched in every direction, and tied around the instep with pieces of pack-thread, this assassin outraged the most outré and revolting attitudes of the chahut, darting from right to left, before and behind, his lanky limbs as hard as steel, and twisting and twining, and springing and bounding with such vigour and elasticity, that he seemed set in motion by steel springs. A worthy coryphée of this filthy saturnalia, his lady partner, a tall and active creature with impudent and flushed features, attired en débardeur, wore a flat cap on one side of a powdered wig with a thick pigtail, a waistcoat and trousers of worn green velvet, adjusted to her shape by an orange scarf, with long ends flowing down her back. A fat, vulgar, coarse woman, the brutal ogress of the tapis franc, was seated on one of the benches, holding on her knees the plaid cloaks of this creature and the vivandière, whilst they were rivalling the bounds and jumps and gross postures of the Skeleton and Nicholas Martial. Amongst the other dancers there was a lame boy, dressed like a devil, by means of a black net vest much too large for him, red drawers, and a green mask hideous and grotesque. In spite of his infirmity, this little monster was wonderfully agile, and his precocious depravity equalled, if it could not exceed, that of his detestable companions, and he gambolled as impudently as any of them before a fat woman, dressed as a shepherdess, who excited her partner the more by her shouts of laughter. No charge having been raised against Tortillard, our readers have recognised him, and Bras Rouge having been for the while left in prison, the boy, at his father's request, was reclaimed by Micou, the receiver of the passage of the Brasserie, who had not been denounced by his accomplices. As secondary figures in this picture, let imagination conceive all there is of the lowest, most shameful, and most monstrous in this idle, wanton, insolent, rapacious, atheistical, sanguinary assemblage of infamy, which is most hostile to social order, and to which we would call the attention of all thinking persons as our recital draws to a close. Excited by the shouts of laughter and the cheers of the mob assembled around the windows, the actors in the infamous dance cried to the orchestra for a finale galop. The musicians, delighted to reach the end of their labours, complied with the general wish, and played a gallopade with the utmost energy and rapidity. At this the excitement redoubled; the couples encircled each other and dashed away, following the Skeleton and his partner, who led off their infernal round amidst the wildest cries and acclamations. The crowd was so thick, so dense, and the evolutions so multiplied and rapid, that these creatures, inflamed with wine, exercise, and noise, their intoxication became delirious frenzy, and they soon ceased to have space for their movements. The Skeleton then cried in a breathless voice, "Look out at the door! We will go out on to the boulevard." "Yes, yes!" cried the mob at the windows. "A gallop as far as the Barrière St. Jacques!" "The two mottes will soon be here." "The headsman cuts double." "How funny!" "Yes, with a cornet à piston accompaniment." "I'll ask the widow to be my partner." "And I the daughter." "Death to the informers!" "Long live the prigs and lads of steel!" cried the Skeleton in a voice of thunder, as he and the dancers, forcing their way in the midst of the mass, set the whole body in motion. And then were heard cries and imprecations and shouts of laughter, which had nothing human in their sound. Suddenly this uproar reached its height by two fresh incidents. The vehicle which contained the criminals, accompanied by its escort of cavalry, appeared at the angle of the boulevard, and then all the mob rushed in that direction, shouting and roaring with ferocious delight. At this moment, also, the crowd was met by a courier coming from the Boulevard des Invalides, and galloping towards the Barrière de Charenton. He was dressed in a light blue jacket with yellow collar, with a double row of silver lace down the seams, but, as a mark of deep mourning, he wore black breeches and high boots. His cap, also, with a broad band of silver, was encircled with crape, and on the winkers of his horse were the arms of Gerolstein. He walked his horse, his advance becoming every moment more difficult, and he was almost obliged to stop when he found himself in the midst of the sea of people we have described. Although he called to them, and moved his horse with the greatest caution, cries, abuse, and threats were soon directed against him. "Does he want to ride us down, that vagabond?" "He's got lots of silver on his precious body," cried Tortillard. "If he comes against us, we'll make him alight and strip the tin off his jacket to go to the melters," said Nicholas. "And we'll take the seams out of your carcass if you are not careful, you cursed jockey," added the Skeleton, addressing the courier and seizing the bridle of his horse, for the crowd was so dense that the ruffian had given up his idea of dancing to the barrier. The courier, who was a powerful and resolute fellow, said to the Skeleton, lifting the handle of his whip, "If you do not let go my bridle, I'll lay my whip over you. Let me pass. My lord's carriage is coming close behind. Let me go forward, I say." "Your lord!" said the Skeleton. "What is your lord to me? I'll slit his weasand if I like. I never did for a lord. I should like to try my hand." "There are no more lords now. Vive la Charte!" shouted Tortillard; and as he said so he whistled a verse of the Parisienne, and, clinging to one of the courier's legs, nearly drew him out of his saddle. A blow with the handle of his whip on Tortillard's head punished his insolence. But the populace instantly attacked the courier, who in vain spurred his horse; he could not advance a step. Dismounted, amidst the shouts of the mob, he would have been murdered but for the arrival of Rodolph's carriage, which took off the attention of these wretches. The prince's travelling carriage, drawn by 4 horses, had for some time past advanced at only a foot pace, and one of the 2 footmen had got down from the rubble and was walking by the side of the door, which was very low. The postilion kept crying out to the people, and went forward very cautiously. Rodolph was dressed in deep mourning, as was also his daughter, one of whose hands he held in his own, looking at her with affection. The gentle and lovely face of Fleur de Marie was enclosed in a small capot of black crape, which heightened the dazzling brilliancy of her skin and the beautiful hue of her lovely brown hair, and the azure of this bright day was reflected in her large eyes, which had never been of more transparent and softened blue. Although her features wore a gentle smile, and expressed calmness and happiness when she looked at her father, yet a tinge of melancholy, and sometimes of undefinable sadness, threw its shadow over her countenance when her eyes were not fixed on her father. At this moment the carriage came amongst the crowd and began to slacken its pace. Rodolph lowered the window, and said in German to the lackey who was walking by the window: "Well, Franz, what is the meaning of this?" "Monseigneur, there is such a crowd that the horses cannot move." "What has this assemblage collected for?" "Monseigneur, there is an execution going on." "Ah, frightful!" said Rodolph, throwing himself back at his carriage. "What is it, my dear father?" asked Fleur de Marie, with uneasiness. "Nothing, nothing, dearest." "Only listen! These threatening cries approach us. What can it be?" "Desire them to reach Charenton by another road," said Rodolph. "Monseigneur, it is too late; the crowd has stopped the horses." The footman could say no more. The mob, excited by the savage encouragement of the Skeleton and Nicholas, suddenly surrounded the carriage, and, in spite of the threats of the postilion, stopped the horses, and Rodolph saw on all sides threatening, furious countenances, and above them all the Skeleton, who came to the door of the carriage. "Take care, my dear father!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie, throwing her arms around Rodolph's neck. "Oh, you are the 'my lord,' are you?" said the Skeleton, thrusting his hideous head into the carriage. Had it not been for his daughter's presence, Rodolph would have given way to the natural impetuosity of his character at this insolence; but he controlled himself, and coolly replied: "What do you want, and why do you stop my carriage?" "Because we choose," said the Skeleton, "each in his turn. Yesterday you trampled on the mob, and to day the mob will crush you if you stir." "Father, we are lost!" murmured Fleur de Marie. "Take courage, love. I understand," replied the prince. "It is the last day of the carnival. These fellows are tipsy. I will get rid of them." "I say, my covey, come, get out, and your mott with you!" cried Nicholas. "Why should you trample upon a parcel of poor people?" "You seem to have drunk a good deal, and to desire to drink more," said Rodolph. "Here, take this, and do not delay my carriage any longer." And he threw out his purse, which Tortillard caught. "Oh, what! You are going to travel, eh? Well, then, you've got your pockets well lined, no doubt. Come, shell out, my blade, or I'll have your life!" And he opened the door suddenly. Rodolph's patience was exhausted. Alarmed for Fleur de Marie, whose alarm increased every moment, and believing that a display of vigour would daunt the wretch, whom he believed to be only drunk, he sprung from the carriage, intending to seize the Skeleton by the throat. The latter suddenly receded, and then, drawing a long knife dirk from his pocket, rushed at Rodolph. Fleur de Marie, seeing the dirk raised to stab her father, gave a shriek, sprung from the carriage, and threw her arms around him. Her father's life must have been sacrificed but for the Chourineur, who, at the commencement of this tumult, having recognised the livery of the prince, had contrived, by superhuman efforts, to reach the Skeleton. And at the moment when that ruffian menaced the prince with his knife, the Chourineur seized on his arm with one hand, and with the other grasping his collar, threw him backwards. Although surprised, and from behind too, the Skeleton turned around, and, recognising the Chourineur, cried: "What, the man in the gray blouse from La Force? This time, then, I'll do for you!" And, rushing furiously at the Chourineur, he plunged his knife in his breast. The Chourineur staggered, but did not fall. The crowd kept him on his legs. "The guard! Here come the guard!" exclaimed several voices in alarm. At these words, and at the sight of the murder of the Chourineur, all this dense crowd, fearing to be compromised in the assassination, dispersed as if by magic, and fled in every direction. The Skeleton, Nicholas, Martial, and Tortillard, amongst the earliest. When the guard came up, guided by the courier, who had escaped when the crowd had let him go to surround the prince's carriage, there only remained in this sad scene Rodolph, his daughter, and the Chourineur, bathed in his blood. The two servants of the prince had seated him on the ground with his back to a tree. All this passed more quickly than it can be described, and at a few paces from the guinguette from which the Skeleton and his band had issued. The prince, pale and agitated, held in his arms Fleur de Marie, half fainting, whilst the postilions were repairing the harness broken in the scuffle. "Quick!" said the prince to his servants engaged in aiding the Chourineur. Convey this poor fellow to the cabaret; and you," he added, turning to the courier, "get on the box, and gallop back for Doctor David at the hôtel. You will find him there, as he does not leave until 11 o'clock." The carriage went away at a great speed, and the two servants conveyed the Chourineur to the low apartment in which the orgies had taken place. Several of the women were still there. "My poor, dear child," said Rodolph to his daughter, "let me take you to some room in this place where you can await me, for I cannot abandon this brave fellow, who has again saved my life."
"Oh, my dearest father, I entreat you, do not leave me!" exclaimed Fleur de Marie, with alarm, and seizing Rodolph's arm. "Do not leave me alone! I should die with fright. Where you go, I will go."
"But this frightful spectacle!"
"Yes, thanks to this worthy man, you still live for me, my father, and therefore allow me to join you in thanking and consoling him."
The prince's perplexity was very great. His daughter evinced so much just fear of remaining alone in a room in this low haunt that he made up his mind to allow her to enter with him into the apartment, where they found the Chourineur. The mistress of the tavern and many of the women who had remained, and amongst whom was the ogress of the tapis franc, had hastily laid the wounded man on a mattress, and then stanched and bound his wound with napkins. The Chourineur opened his eyes as Rodolph entered. At the sight of the prince his features, pale with approaching death, became animated. He smiled painfully, and said in a low voice, "Ah, M. Rodolph, it was very fortunate I was there." "Brave and devoted as ever," said the prince, in an accent of despair, "again you have saved my life." "I was going to the barrier of Charenton, to try and see you go by, see you for the last time. Fortunately, I was unable to get in for the crowd. Besides, it was to happen. I told Martial so. I had a presentiment." "A presentiment?" "Yes, M. Rodolph, the dream of the sergeant last night." "Oh, try and forget such ideas. Let us hope the wound is not mortal." "Oh, yes, the skeleton struck home. Never mind. I told Martial that a worm of the earth like me might sometimes be useful to a great lord like you." "But my life, I owe my life again to you." "We are quits, M. Rodolph. You told me that I had heart and honour. That word, you see, oh, I am choking! Sir, without my asking, do me the honour to give me your hand. I feel I am sinking." "No, no, impossible!" exclaimed the prince, bending towards the Chourineur, and clasping in his hands the icy hand of the dying man. "No, you will live, you will live!" "M. Rodolph, there is something, you see, above. I killed with the blow of a knife. I die from the blow of a knife," said the Chourineur, who was sinking fast. At this moment his eyes turned towards Fleur de Marie, whom he had not before perceived. Amazement was depicted on his dying features. He made a movement, and said, "Ah, la Goualeuse!" "Yes, my daughter, who blesses you for having preserved her father." "She, your daughter, here? That reminds me of how our acquaintance began, M. Rodolph, and the blows with the fist. But this blow with the knife will be the last blow. I slashed, and in my turn am slashed, stabbed. It is just." He heaved a deep sigh. His head fell back. He was dead. The sound of horses without was heard. Rodolph's carriage had met that of Murphy and David, who, in their desire to rejoin the prince, had anticipated the hour fixed for their departure. "David," said Rodolph, wiping his eyes, and pointing to the Chourineur, "is there no hope?" "None, monseigneur," replied the doctor, after a moment's examination. During this moment there passed a mute and terrible scene between Fleur de Marie and the ogress, whom Rodolph had not observed. When the Chourineur had uttered the name of La Goualeuse, The ogress had raised her head and looked at Fleur de Marie. The horrid hag had already recognised Rodolph. He was called Monseigneur; he called La Goualeuse his daughter. Such a metamorphosis astounded the ogress, who obstinately fixed her stupid, wondering eyes on her former victim. Fleur de Marie, pale and overcome, seemed fascinated by her gaze. The death of the Chourineur, the unexpected appearance of the ogress, which came to awaken more painfully than ever the remembrance of her former degradation, appeared to her a sinister presage. From this moment, Fleur de Marie was struck with one of those presentiments which, in dispositions like hers, have most frequently an irresistible influence. A few days after these events, and Rodolph and his daughter quitted Paris for ever. CHAPTER XII. Epilogue. Chapter I. Of the Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This recording is in the public domain. Gerolstein. Prince Henry of Herkaüsen, Oldenzaal, to the Count Maximilian Kaminetz. Oldenzaal, 25th August, 1840. I am just arrived from Gerolstein, where I have passed 3 months with the Grand Duke and his family. I expected to find a letter announcing your arrival at Oldenzaal, my dear Maximilian. Judge of my surprise, of my regret, on hearing that you will be detained in Hungary for several weeks. For more than 4 months I have been unable to write to you, not knowing where to direct my letters, thanks to your original and adventurous manner of travelling. You had, however, formally promised me at Vienna that you would be at Oldenzaal the 1st of August. I must then give up the pleasure of seeing you, and yet I have never had greater need of pouring forth my sorrows to you, Maximilian, my oldest friend, for although we are both of us still very young, our friendship is of long standing, as it dates from our childhood. What shall I say to you? During the last 3 months a complete revolution has taken place in me. I am at one of those moments that decide the existence of a man. Judge, then, how necessary your presence and your advice are to me. But you will not long be wanting, whatever motives you have for remaining in Hungary. Come, come, I entreat of you, Maximilian, for I stand in need of you to console me, and I cannot go to seek you. My father, whose health is daily declining, has summoned me from Gerolstein. Each day makes so great an alteration in him that it is impossible for me to leave him. I have so much to say that I shall become tedious, but I must relate to you the most important, the most romantic incident of my life. Why were you not there, my friend? Why were you not there? For 3 months my heart has been a prey to emotions equally sweet and sorrowful, and I was alone. I was alone. Sympathise with me, you who know the sensibility of my heart, you who have seen my eyes filled with tears at the simple recital of a noble or generous action, at the simple sight of a splendid sunset, of the sky studded with bright stars. Do you recollect last year, on our excursion to the ruins of Oppenfeld, on the shore of the vast lake, our reveries during that evening, so full of calm, of poesy, and of peace? Strange contrast! It was 3 days before that bloody duel, in which I would not accept you for my second, for I should have suffered too much for you had I been wounded before your eyes, the duel in which, for a dispute at play, my second unhappily killed the young Frenchman, the Comte de Saint Remy. Apropos, do you know what has become of the dangerous siren whom M. de Saint Remy brought with him to Oppenfeld, and whose name was, I think, Cecily David? You will doubtless, my friend, smile with pity at seeing me thus losing myself amongst idle recollections of the past, instead of coming at once to the grave disclosures that I have announced my intention of making. But, in spite of myself, I delay the time from moment to moment. I know how severe you are, and I am fearful of being blamed. Yes, blamed; because, instead of acting with reflection and prudence of 1 and 20, alas! I have acted foolishly, or rather, I have not acted at all, as I have suffered myself to be carried away by the stream that urged me on, and it is only since my return from Gerolstein that I have been awakened from the enchanting vision that has lulled me to sleep for the last 3 months, and this awakening has been a sorrowful one. Now, my friend, my dear Maximilian, I take courage. Hear me indulgently. I begin with fear and trembling. I dare not look at you, for when you read these lines, how grave and stern will your face become, stoic that you are! After having obtained leave of absence for 6 months, I left Vienna, and remained some time with my father. His health was then good, and he advised me to visit my aunt, the Princess Juliana, superior of the abbey of Gerolstein. I think I have already told you that my grandfather was cousin german to the present duke's grandfather, and the Duke Gustavus Rodolph, thanks to their relationship, had always treated my father and myself as his cousins. You also know, I think, that during a long stay the prince made recently in France my father was left at the head of the affairs of the duchy. It is not any feeling of ostentatious pride, as you well know, Maximilian, that makes me recapitulate all these circumstances, but to explain to you the causes of the extreme intimacy that existed between the grand duke and myself during my stay at Gerolstein. Do you recollect that last year, after our voyage on the banks of the Rhine, we heard that the prince had found and married, in extremis, the Countess Macgregor, in order to legitimize the daughter he had had by her by a previous and secret marriage, afterwards annulled, because it had been contracted against the consent of the late Grand Duke? This young girl thus formally recognised, this charming Princess Amelie, of whom Lord Dudley, who had seen her at Gerolstein about a year ago, spoke to us with an enthusiasm that we suspected of exaggeration. Strange chance! Who would have said then? But although you have doubtless penetrated my secret, let me pursue the progress of events. The convent of St. Hermangeld, of which my aunt is abbess, is scarcely a quarter of a league from Gerolstein, for the gardens of the abbey touch the outskirts of the town. A charming house, perfectly isolated from the cloisters, had been placed at my disposal by my aunt, who has, as you know, the affection of a mother for me. The day of my arrival, she informed me a grand drawing room would be held the next day, as the Grand Duke was going formally to announce his intended marriage with la Marquise d'Harville, who had just arrived at Gerolstein with her father, the Comte d'Orbigny. The duke was blamed by some for not having sought an alliance with some royal house, but others, and amongst them my aunt, congratulated him on having chosen, instead of the marriage of ambition, a young and lovely woman to whom he was deeply attached, and who belonged to one of the first families in France. You know, too, that my aunt has always had the greatest regard for the Grand Duke, and has always appreciated his fine qualities. "My dear child," said she to me, speaking of the drawing room, to which I was going the next day, "my dear child, the most astonishing sight you will see to morrow will be the Pearl of Gerolstein." "Of whom are you talking, my dear aunt?" "Of the Princess Amelie, the Grand Duke's daughter. Lord Dudley spoke of her at Vienna with warmth we suspected of exaggeration." "At my age and in my position," replied my aunt, "people do not exaggerate, so you can trust to my judgment, and I assure you I never knew any one more enchanting than the Princess Amelie. I would speak of her beauty were it not for an indefinable charm she possesses, superior even to her beauty. From the first day that the Grand Duke presented me to her, I felt myself irresistibly drawn towards her, and I am not the only person. The Archduchess Sophia is at Gerolstein, and is the most proud and haughty princess I know." "Very true, aunt. Her irony is terrible; very few persons escape from her sarcasms. At Vienna every one dreaded her. Can the Princess Amelie have found favour in her eyes?" "The other day she came here after visiting the asylum placed under the princess's direction. 'Do you know,' said this redoubtable archduchess to me, 'that if I resided long with the Grand Duke's daughter, I should become quite harmless, so contagious is her goodness.'" "Why, my cousin must be an enchantress," said I, laughing, to my aunt. "Her most powerful charm, at least in my eyes," replied my aunt, "is the mixture of sweetness, modesty, and dignity that I have told you of, and which gives a most touching expression to her face." "Indeed, aunt, modesty is a rare quality in a princess so young, so beautiful, and so happy." Reflect that the princess is still more deserving of praise for her modesty, as her elevation is so very recent. In her interview with you, aunt, did the princess make any reference to her early life?" "No; but when, notwithstanding my advanced age, I addressed her with the respect due to her rank, since her royal highness is the grand duke's daughter, her ingenuous confusion, mingled with gratitude and veneration for me, quite overpowered me; for her reserve, full of dignity and affability, proved to me that her present elevation did not make her forget her past life, and that she accorded to my age what I accorded to her rank." "It must require," said I, "the most perfect tact to observe those nice differences." "My dear boy, the more I see of the princess, the more I congratulate myself on my first impression. Since she has been here the number of charitable acts she has done is incredible, and that with a reflection and a judgment that in a person of her age quite surprises me. Judge yourself. At her request, the grand duke has founded at Gerolstein an establishment for orphans of 5 or 6 years, and for young girls, who are either orphans or abandoned by their parents, of the age of 16, that age so fatal to those who are not protected against the temptations of vice or the pressure of want. The good sisters of my convent teach and direct the children of this asylum. During my visits there I have had ample opportunities of judging of the adoration of these poor, unfortunate creatures have for the princess. Every day she spends several hours at this place, which is placed under her protection, and I repeat that it is not merely gratitude and respect that the children and nuns feel towards the princess, it almost amounts to fanaticism." "The princess must be an angel," said I to my aunt. "An angel, indeed," replied she, "for you cannot conceive with what touching kindness she treats her young protégées. I have never seen the susceptibility of misfortune meet with more delicate sympathy. You would think some irresistible attraction drew the princess towards this class of unfortunates. Will you believe it? She, the daughter of a sovereign, only addresses these poor children as 'my sisters.'" At these last words of my aunt I confess I felt my eyes fill with tears. "Do you not also admire the admirable and pious conduct of this young princess?" "Since the princess," said I, "is so marvellously gifted, I shall be greatly embarrassed when I am presented to her to morrow. You know how timid I am. You know, also, that elevation of character imposes upon me more than high birth, so that I am certain to appear both stupid and embarrassed to morrow; so I make up my mind to that beforehand." "Come, come," said my aunt, smiling, "she will take pity upon you, the more readily as you are not quite a stranger to her." "I am not a stranger to her, aunt." "Certainly not." "How so?" "You recollect that when at the age of 16 you left Oldenzaal, to travel with your father through Russia and England, I had your portrait painted in the costume you wore at the first bal costumé the late duchess gave?" "Yes, aunt, the costume of a German page of the 16th century. Our famous painter, Fritz Mocker, whilst he painted a faithful likeness of you, not only produced a page of that century, but even the style of the pictures of that time. Some days after her arrival at Gerolstein, the Princess Amelie, who had come with her father to visit me, remarked your portrait, and asked what was that charming picture of olden times. Her father smiled, and said, 'This is the portrait of a cousin of ours, who would be, were he now alive, as you see by his dress, some 300 years old, but who, although very young, made himself remarkable for his courage and goodness of heart. Has he not bravery in his eyes and goodness in his smile?' Do not, I entreat you, Maximilian, shrug your shoulders with disdain at seeing me write these puerile details of myself, which are, alas, necessary to my story. The Princess Amelie," continued my aunt, "deceived by this innocent pleasantry, after a long examination of your portrait, joined with her father in praising the amiable and determined expression of your face. Some time after, when I went to Gerolstein, she questioned me playfully about 'her cousin of the olden time.' I then explained the trick to her, and told her that the handsome page of the 16th century was really the Prince Henry d'Herkhausen Oldenzaal, a young man of 21, captain in the guards of his Majesty the Emperor of Austria, and in every other respect than the costume very like his picture. At these words the princess," continued my aunt, "blushed and became serious, and has never since spoken of the picture. However, you see that you are not quite a stranger to your cousin; so take courage, and maintain the reputation of your portrait." This conversation took place, as I have already told you, the evening previous to the day on which I was to be presented to the princess my cousin. I left my aunt, and returned to my own apartments. You have often told me, my dear Maximilian, that I was totally free from vanity. I must therefore trust to that to prevent my appearing vain during this recital. As soon as I was alone, I reflected with a secret satisfaction that the Princess Amelie, after seeing my portrait painted 5 or 6 years ago, had inquired after "her cousin of the olden time." Nothing could be more absurd than to build the slightest hope on so trivial a circumstance, I acknowledge; but I always treat you with the most perfect confidence, and I acknowledge that this trifling circumstance delighted me. No doubt the praise I had just heard bestowed on the princess by so grave and austere a person as my aunt, by raising her in my estimation, rendered this circumstance more agreeable. Why should I tell you? The hopes I conceived from this trifling event were so mad that, now that I look back more calmly on the past, I ask myself how I could have indulged in ideas that must have ended in my destruction. Although related to the grand duke, and always treated by him with the greatest kindness, yet it was impossible to entertain the slightest hope of a marriage with the princess. Even had she returned my affection, it would still have been impossible. Our family holds an honourable position, but it is poor when compared with the grand duke, the richest prince of the German Confederation; and besides, I was only 21, a simple captain in the guards, without any reputation or any position. Never could the grand duke think of me as a suitor for his daughter. All these reflections ought to have saved me from a passion I did not as yet feel, but of which I had a strange presentiment. Alas! I rather gave way to fresh puerilities. I wore on my finger a ring that Thecla, the countess of whom I have so often spoken, had given me, although this souvenir of a boyish love could not have much embarrassed me. I sacrificed it to my new flame, and, opening the window, I cast the ring into the waves of the river that flowed beneath. I have no need to tell you what a night I passed. You can imagine. I knew the princess was very beautiful. I sought to picture to myself her features, her air, her manner, her figure, the sound of her voice; and, thinking of my portrait, which she had noticed, I recollected that the artist had flattered me excessively, and I contrasted the picturesque dress of a page of the 16th century with the simple uniform of a captain of the Austrian guards. But amidst all these absurd ideas some generous thoughts crossed my mind, and I was overcome, yes, overcome by the recollection of the tenderness of the princess for those poor girls whom she always terms my sisters. The next day the hour for the reception came. I tried on several uniforms, one after another, found them all to fit me very ill, and departed very dissatisfied with myself. Although Gerolstein is only a quarter of a league from St. Ermengeld, during the short journey all the childish ideas that had so occupied me during the night had given place to one sad and grave thought. An invincible presentiment told me I was approaching one of the crises of my life. A magical inspiration revealed to me that I was about to love as a man loves but once in his life; and, as if to complete my misfortunes, this love, as loftily as deservedly bestowed, was doomed to be unhappy. You do not know the grand ducal palace of Gerolstein. In the opinion of every one who has visited the capitals of Europe, there is, with the exception of Versailles, no royal residence that has a more regal and imposing appearance. If at this time I speak of this, it is because, thinking over them, I wonder how they did not recall me to myself; for the Princess Amelie was the daughter of the sovereign of this palace, these guards, and of these riches. You arrived at the palace by the marble court, so called because, with the exception of a drive for the carriages, it is paved with variegated marble, forming the most magnificent mosaics, in the centre of which is a basin of breccia antique, into which a stream of water flows from a porphyry vase. This court of honour is surrounded by a row of beautiful marble statues, holding candelabras of gilt bronze, from which sprung brilliant jets of gas. Alternately with these statues are the Medicean vases, raised on richly sculptured pedestals, and filled with rose laurels, whose leaves shine in the lights with a metallic lustre. The carriages stopped at the foot of the double staircase leading to the peristyle of the palace. At the foot of this staircase were stationed on guard, mounted on their black horses, 2 soldiers of the regiment of the guards of the Grand Duke. You would have been struck with the stern and warlike appearance of these 2 giants, whose cuirasses and helmets, made like those of the ancients, without crest or plume, sparkled in the sun. These soldiers wore blue coats with yellow collars, buckskin breeches, and jack boots. To please you who are so fond of military details, I add, that at the top landing of the staircase were stationed, as sentinels, 2 grenadiers of the foot guards of the duke. Their uniform, with the exception of the colour of the coat and facings, resembles, I am told, that of Napoleon's grenadiers. After traversing the vestibule, where the porters of the duke were stationed, halberd in hand, I ascended a splendid staircase of white marble, which opened upon a portico, ornamented with jasper columns, and surmounted by a painted and gilt cupola. There were 2 long files of domestics. I then entered the guard room, at the door of which I found a chamberlain and an aide de camp, whose duty it was to present to his royal highness those persons who were entitled to this honour. My relationship, though distant, procured me a special presentation. An aide de camp preceded me into a long gallery, filled with gentlemen in full court dress or uniform, and splendidly attired ladies. Whilst I passed through this brilliant assembly, I heard here and there remarks that augmented my embarrassment. Every one admired the angelic beauty of the Princess Amelie, the charming appearance of the Marquise d'Harville, and the imperial air of the Archduchess Sophia, who, recently arrived from Munich with the Archduke Stanislaus, was about to depart for Warsaw. But, whilst rendering their just tribute of admiration to the lofty bearing of the duchess and to the charms of the Marquise d'Harville, every one agreed that nothing could exceed the loveliness of the Princess Amelie. As I approached the spot where the Grand Duke and the princess were I felt my heart beat more and more violently. At the moment that I entered the salon, I forgot to tell you there was a concert and ball at court, the famous Liszt sat down to the piano, and instantly the most profound silence succeeded the conversation that was going on. I waited in the embrasure of a door until Liszt had finished the piece he was playing with his accustomed taste. It was then that I saw the Princess Amelie for the first time. I must tell you all that passed, for I feel an indescribable pleasure in writing it. Picture to yourself a large salon furnished with regal splendour, brilliantly lighted up, and hung with crimson silk, embroidered with wreaths of flowers and gold. In the first row, on large gilt chairs, sat the Archduchess Sophia with Madame d'Harville on her left, and the Princess Amelie on her right. Behind them stood the duke in the uniform of colonel of the guards. He seemed scarcely 30, and the military uniform set off his fine figure and noble features. Beside him was the Archduke Stanislaus in the uniform of a field marshal. Then came the princess's maids of honour, the ladies of the grand dignitaries of the court, and then the dignitaries themselves. I need scarcely tell you that the Princess Amelie was less conspicuous by her rank than by her extraordinary beauty. Do not condemn me without reading this description of her. Although it falls far short of the reality, you will understand my adoration. You will understand that as soon as I saw her I loved her, and that the suddenness of my passion can only be equalled by its violence and its eternity. The Princess Amelie was dressed in a plain white watered silk dress, and wore, like the Archduchess, the riband of the Imperial Order of St. Nepomucenus, recently sent to her by the Empress. A diadem of pearls surrounded her head, and harmonized admirably with 2 splendid braids of fair hair that shaded her delicate cheeks. Her arms, whiter than the lace that ornamented them, were half hidden in long gloves, reaching nearly to her elbow. Nothing could be more perfect than her figure, nothing more charming than her foot in its satin slipper. At the moment when I saw her, her beaming blue eyes wore a pensive expression. I do not know whether some serious thought came over her, or whether she was impressed with the grave melody of the piece Liszt was playing, but the expression of her countenance seemed to me full of sweetness and melancholy. Never can I express my feelings at that moment. All that my aunt had related of her goodness crossed my mind. Smile if you will, but my eyes became full of tears when I saw this young girl, so beautiful and so idolized by such a father, seem so melancholy and pensive. You know how scrupulously etiquette and the privileges of rank are observed by us. Thanks to my title and my relationship to the Grand Duke, the crowd in the midst of which I stood gradually fell back, and I found myself left almost alone in the embrasure of the door. It was, no doubt, owing to this circumstance that the princess, awaking from her reverie, perceived, and no doubt recognized me, for she started and blushed. She had seen my portrait at my aunt's, and recognized me. Nothing could be more simple. The princess's eyes did not rest upon me an instant, but that look threw me into the most violent confusion. I felt my cheeks glow, I cast down my eyes, and did not venture to raise them for some time. When I dared at last to steal a glance at the princess she was speaking in a low tone to the archduchess, who seemed to listen to her with the most affectionate interest. Liszt having paused for a few moments between the pieces he was playing, the Grand Duke took the opportunity of expressing his admiration. On returning to his place he perceived me, nodded kindly to me, and said something to the archduchess, fixing his eyes on me at the same time. The duchess, after looking at me a moment, turned to the duke, who smiled and said something to his daughter that seemed to embarrass her, for she blushed again. I was on thorns. But unfortunately etiquette forbade my leaving my place until the concert was over. As soon as the concert was finished I followed the aide de camp. He conducted me to the Grand Duke, who deigned to advance a few steps towards me, took me by the arm, and said to the Archduchess Sophia, "Permit me to present to your royal highness my cousin, Prince Henry of Herkaüsen Oldenzaal." "I have seen the prince at Vienna, and meet him here with pleasure," replied the duchess, before whom I inclined myself respectfully. "My dear Amelie," continued the prince, addressing his daughter, "this is Prince Henry, your cousin, the son of one of my most valued friends, Prince Paul, whom I greatly lament not seeing here to day." "Pray, monseigneur, inform the prince that I equally regret his absence, for I am always delighted to know any of my father's friends." I had not until then heard the princess's voice, and I was struck with its intense sweetness. "I hope, my dear Henry, you will stay some time with your aunt," said the Grand Duke. "Come and see us often about 3 o'clock en famille; and if we ride out you must accompany us. You know how great an affection I have always felt for you, for your noble qualities. I cannot express my gratitude for your royal highness's kindness." "Well, to prove it," said the Grand Duke, smiling, "engage your cousin for the second quadrille. The first belongs to the archduke." "Will your royal highness do me the honour?" said I to my cousin. "Oh, call each other cousin, as in the good old times," replied the duke, laughing. "There should be no ceremony between relations." "Will you dance with me, cousin?" "Yes, cousin," replied the princess. I cannot tell how much I felt the touching kindness of the Grand Duke, and how bitterly I reproached myself for yielding to an affection the prince would never authorize. I vowed inwardly that nothing should induce me to acquaint my cousin with my affection, but I feared my emotion would betray me. I had leisure for these reflections whilst my cousin danced the first quadrille with the Archduke Stanislaus. Nothing was more suited to display the graces of the princess's person than the slow movements of the dance. I anxiously awaited my turn; and I succeeded in concealing my emotion when I led her to the quadrille. "Does your royal highness sanction my calling you cousin?" said I. "Oh, yes, cousin, I am always delighted to obey my father." "I rejoice in this familiarity, since I have learnt from my aunt to know you." "My father has often spoken of you, cousin; and what may, perhaps, astonish you," added she, timidly, "I also knew you by sight."
For one day the abbess of St. Ermengarde, your aunt, for whom I have the greatest respect, showed me your picture."
"As a page of the 16th century?"
"Yes, cousin; and my father was malicious enough to tell me that it was an ancestor of ours, and spoke so highly of his courage and his other qualities that our family ought to be proud of their descent from him."
"Alas, cousin, I fear my resemblance to my portrait is not great."
"You are mistaken, cousin," said the princess; "for at the end of the concert I recognised you immediately, in spite of the difference of costume."
Then, wishing to change the conversation, she added,
"How charmingly M. Liszt plays, does he not?"
"Yes. How attentively you listen to him!"
"Because there is to me a double charm in music without words. Not only you hear the execution, but you can adapt your thoughts to the melody. Do you understand me?"
"Perfectly. Your own thoughts become words to the air."
"Yes, you quite comprehend me," said she, with a gesture of satisfaction. "I feared I could not express what I felt just now."
"I thank God, cousin," said I, smiling, "you can have no words to set to so sad an air." I know not whether my question was indiscreet or whether she had not heard me, but suddenly she exclaimed, pointing out to me the grand duke, who crossed the room with the archduchess on his arm,
"Cousin, look at my father, how handsome he is! How noble! How good! Every one looks at him as if they loved him more than they feared him."
"Ah!" cried I, "it is not only here he is beloved. If the blessing of his people be transmitted to their posterity, the name of Rodolph of Gerolstein will be immortal."
"To speak thus is to be, indeed, worthy of his attachment."
"I do but give utterance to the feelings of all present. See how they all hasten to pay their respects to Madame d'Harville."
"No one in the world is more worthy of my father's affections than Madame d'Harville."
"You are more capable than any one of appreciating her, as you have been in France." Scarcely had I pronounced these words than the princess cast down her eyes, and her features assumed an air of melancholy; and when I led her back to her seat the expression of them was still the same. I suppose that my allusion to her stay in France recalled the death of her mother. In the course of the evening a circumstance occurred which you may think too trivial to mention, perhaps, but which evinces the extraordinary influence this young girl universally inspires. Her bandeau of pearls having become disarranged, the Archduchess Sophia, who was leaning on her arm, kindly readjusted the ornament upon her brow. Knowing, as we do, the hauteur of the archduchess, such condescension is almost inconceivable. The next morning I was invited, together with a few other persons, to be present at the marriage of the Grand Duke with Madame la Marquise d'Harville. I had never seen the princess so radiant and happy. Some days after the duke's marriage I had a long interview with him. He questioned me about my past life, my future career. He gave me the most admirable advice, the kindest encouragement; so much so that the idea crossed my mind that he had perceived my love and wished to bring me to confess it. But this idea was soon dispelled. The prince concluded by telling me that the great wars were over, that I ought to avail myself of my name, my connections, the education I had received, and my father's friendship with the Prince de M , prime minister of the emperor, in order to follow a diplomatic instead of a military career. In a word, he offered me his sovereign protection to facilitate my entry in the career he proposed to me. I thanked him for his offers with gratitude, and added that I felt the weight of his advice and would follow it. I at first visited the palace very seldom; but, thanks to the duke's reiterated invitations, I was soon there almost every day. We lived in the peaceful retirement resembling that of some English mansions. When the weather permitted, we rode out with the duke, the duchess, and the grand personages of the court. When we were forced to remain at home we sang, and I accompanied the grand duchess and my cousin, who had the sweetest and most expressive voice I ever heard. At other times we inspected the magnificent picture galleries and museums, and the library of the prince, who is one of the most accomplished men in Europe. I often dined at the palace, and on the opera nights I accompanied the duke's family to the theatre. Could this intimacy have lasted for ever I should have been very happy, perhaps, but I reflected that I should be summoned to Vienna by my duties. I reflected, also, that the duke would soon think of finding a suitable alliance for his daughter. My cousin remarked this change in me. The evening before I quitted Gerolstein, she told me she had for several days remarked my abstracted manner. I endeavoured to evade this question, saying that my approaching departure was the cause. "I can scarcely believe it," replied she. "My father treats you like a son, every one loves you. It would be ingratitude if you were unhappy." "Alas!" said I, unable to restrain my emotion, "it is grief I am a prey to." "Why, what has happened?" "Just now, cousin, you have told me your father treated me like a son, and that every one loved me. And yet, ere long, I must quit Gerolstein. It is this that grieves me." "And are the recollections of those you have left as nothing?" "Doubtless; but time brings so many changes." "There are affections, at least, that are unchangeable, such as that of my father for you, such as that I feel for you. When you are once brother and sister, you never forget each other," added she, looking up, her large blue eyes full of tears. I was on the point of betraying myself; however, I controlled my feelings in time. "Do you think, then, cousin," said I, "that when I return in a few years this affection will continue?" "Why should it not?" "Because you will probably be married, you will have other duties to perform, and you will forget your poor brother." This was all that passed. I know not if she was offended at these words, or whether she was like myself grieved at the changes the future must bring. But, instead of answering me, she was silent for a moment, then, rising hastily from her seat, her face pale and altered, she left the room, after having looked for a few seconds at the embroidery of the young Countess d'Oppenheim, one of her maids of honour. The same evening I received a second letter from my father, urging me to return. The next morning I took leave of the grand duke. He told me my cousin was unwell, but that he would make my adieux. He then embraced me tenderly, renewed his promises of assistance, and added that, whenever I had leave of absence, nothing would give him greater pleasure than to see me at Gerolstein. Happily, on my arrival I found my father better; still confined to his bed, and very weak, it is true, but out of danger. Now that you know all, Maximilian, tell me, what can I do?" Just as I finished this letter my door opened, and, to my great surprise, my father, whom I believed to be in bed, entered. He saw the letter on the table. "To whom are you writing so long a letter?" said he, smiling. "To Maximilian, father." "Oh," said he, with an expression of affectionate reproach, "he has all your confidence; he is very happy." He pronounced these last words in so sorrowful a tone that I held out the letter to him, almost without reflection, saying, "Read it, father." My friend, he has read all. After having remained musing some time, he said to me, "Henry, I shall write and inform the grand duke of all that passed during your stay at Gerolstein." "Father, I entreat you not." "Is what you have written to Maximilian scrupulously true?" "Yes." "Do you love your cousin?" "I adore her, but—" My father interrupted me. "Then, in that case, I shall write to the grand duke and demand her hand for you." "But, father, such a demand will be madness on my part." "It is true, but still, in making this demand, I shall acquaint the prince with my reasons for making it. He has received you with the greatest kindness, and it would be unworthy of me to deceive him. He will be touched at the frankness of my demand, and though he refuse it, as he certainly will, he will yet know that, should you ever again visit Gerolstein, you cannot be on the same familiar terms with the princess. You know that, although so tenderly attached to me, my father is inflexible in whatever concerns his duty. Judge, then, of my fears, of my anxiety. I hastily terminate this long letter, but I will soon write again. Sympathise with me, for I fear I shall go mad if the fever that preys on me does not soon abate. Adieu, adieu! Ever yours, Henry Dho. We will now conduct the reader to the palace of Gerolstein, inhabited by Fleur de Marie since her return from France. Epilogue Chapter 1. Read by Céline Major. Epilogue, Chapter 2 of The Mysteries of Paris, Volume 6, by Eugène Sue. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Princess Amélie, Part 1. The apartment of Fleur de Marie, we only call her the Princess Amélie officially, had been, by Rodolph's orders, splendidly furnished. From the balcony of the oratory the 2 towers of the convent of St. Hermangeld were visible, which, embosomed in the woods, were in their turn overtopped by a high hill, at the foot of which the abbey was built. One fine summer's morning Fleur de Marie gazed listlessly at this splendid landscape. Her hair was plainly braided, and she wore a high white dress with blue stripes. A large muslin collar was fastened around her throat by a small blue silk handkerchief, of the same hue as her sash. Seated in a large armchair of carved ebony, she leant her head on her small and delicately white hand. Fleur de Marie's attitude and expression of her face showed that she was a prey to the deepest melancholy. At this instant, a female of a grave and distinguished appearance entered the room, and coughed gently to attract Fleur de Marie's attention. She started from her reverie, and, gracefully acknowledging the salutation of the newcomer, said, "What is it, my dear countess?" "I come to inform you, your royal highness, that the grand duke will be here in a few minutes, and also to ask a favour of you." "Ask it. You know how happy I am to oblige you." "It concerns an unhappy creature who had unfortunately quitted Gerolstein before your royal highness had founded the asylum for orphans and children abandoned by their parents." "What do you wish I should do for her?" "The father went to seek his fortune in America, leaving his wife and daughter to gain a precarious subsistence. The mother died, and this poor girl, then only 16, was seduced and abandoned. She fell lower and lower, until at length she became, like so many others, the opprobrium of her sex." Fleur de Marie turned red and shuddered. The countess, fearing she had wounded the delicacy of the princess by the mention of this girl's condition, replied, "I pray your royal highness to pardon me. I have, doubtless, shocked you by speaking of this wretched creature, but her repentance seemed so sincere that I ventured to plead for her." "You were quite right. Pray continue," said Fleur de Marie, subduing her emotion. "Every fault is worthy of pity when followed by repentance." "After 2 years passed in this wretched mode of existence, she repented sincerely and came back to Gerolstein. She chanced to lodge in the house of a good and pious widow. Encouraged by her kindness, the poor creature told her all her sad story, adding that she bitterly regretted the faults of her early life, and that all she desired was to enter some religious house, where by prayer and penitence she might atone for her sins. She is only 18, very beautiful, and possesses a considerable sum of money, which she wishes to bestow on the convent she enters." "I undertake to provide for her," said Fleur de Marie. "Since she repents, she is worthy of compassion. Her remorse must be more bitter in proportion as it is sincere." "I hear the grand duke," said the lady in waiting, without remarking Fleur de Marie's agitation; and, as she spoke, Rodolph entered, holding a large bouquet of roses in his hand. At the sight of the prince the countess retired, and scarcely had she left the apartment than Fleur de Marie threw herself into her father's arms, and leant her head on his shoulder. "Good morning, love," said Rodolph, pressing her to his heart. "See what beautiful roses! I never saw finer ones." And the prince made a slight motion, as if to disengage himself from her and look at her, when, seeing her weeping, he threw down the bouquet, and, taking her hands, cried, "You are weeping! What is the matter?" "Nothing, dear father," said Fleur de Marie, striving to smile. "My child," replied Rodolph, "you are concealing something from me. Tell me, I entreat you, what thus distresses you. Never mind the bouquet." "Oh, you know how fond I am of roses. I always was. Do you recollect," added she, "my poor little rose tree? I have preserved the pieces of it so carefully." At this terrible allusion Rodolph cried, "Unhappy child! Is it possible that in the midst of all the splendour that surrounds you, you think of the past? Alas! I hoped my tenderness had made you forget it." "Forgive me, dear father. I did not mean what I said. I grieve you." "I grieve, my child, because I know how painful it is for you thus to ponder over the past." "Dear father, it is the first time since I have been here." "The first time you have mentioned it, but not the first time you have thought of it. I have for a long time noticed your sadness, and was unable to account for it. My position was so delicate, though I never told you anything, I thought of you constantly. When I contracted my marriage, I thought it would increase your happiness. I did not venture to hope you would quite forget the past, but I hoped that, cherished and supported by the amiable woman whom I had chosen for my wife, you would look upon the past as amply atoned for by your sufferings. No matter what faults you had committed, they have been 1,000 times expiated by the good you have done since you have been here. Father! Oh, let me tell you all, since a providential chance has brought about this conversation I at once desired and dreaded. I would, to secure your happiness, have sacrificed my affection for Madame d'Harville and my friendship for Murphy, had I thought they recalled the past to you.
Oh, their presence, when they know what I was, and yet love me so tenderly, seems a proof of pardon and oblivion to me. I should have been miserable if for my sake you had renounced Madame d'Harville's hand."
"Oh, you know not what sacrifice Clémence herself would have made, for she was aware of the full extent of my duties to you."
"Duties to me? What have I done to deserve so much goodness?"
"Until the moment that Heaven restored you to me, your life had been one of sorrow and misery, and I reproach myself with your sufferings as if I had caused them, and when I see you happy, it seems to me I am forgiven. My only wish, my sole aim, is to render you as happy as you were before unhappy, to exalt you as you have been abased, for the last trace of your humiliation must disappear when you see the noblest in the land vie with each other who shall show you most respect."
"Respect to me? Oh, no! It is to my rank and not to myself they show respect."
"It is to you, dear child, it is to you."
"You love me so much, dear father, that every one thinks to please you by showing me respect."
"Oh, naughty child!" cried Rodolph, tenderly kissing his daughter. "She will not cede anything to my paternal pride."
"Is not your pride satisfied at my attributing the kindness I receive to you only?"
"No, that is not the same thing. I cannot be proud of myself, but of you. You are ignorant of your own merits. In 15 months your education has been so perfected that the most enthusiastic mother would be proud of you." At this moment the door of the salon opened, and Clémence, Grand Duchess of Gerolstein, entered, holding a letter in her hand.
"Here, love, is a letter from France," said she to Rodolph. "I brought it myself, because I wished to bid good morrow to my dear child, whom I have not yet seen to day."
"This letter arrives most opportunely," said Rodolph. "We were speaking of the past. That monster we must destroy, since he threatens the repose of our child."
"Is it possible that these fits of melancholy we have so often remarked
were occasioned by unhappy recollections? But now that we know the enemy, we shall destroy him."
"From whom is this letter?" asked Clémence.
"From Rigolette, Germain's wife."
"Rigolette!" cried Fleur de Marie. "Oh, I am so glad!"
"Do you not fear that this letter may serve to awaken fresh recollections?" said Clémence, in a low tone to Rodolph. "On the contrary, I wish to destroy these recollections, and I shall, doubtless, find arms in this letter, for Rigolette is a worthy creature, who appreciated and adored our child." Rodolph then read the following letter aloud: "Bouqueval Farm, August 15th, 1841. "Monseigneur, I take the liberty of writing to you to communicate a great happiness which has occurred to us, and to ask of you another favour. Of you, to whom we already owe so much, or rather to whom we owe the real paradise in which we live, myself, my dear Germain, and his good mother. It is this, monseigneur: for the last 10 days I have been crazy with joy, for 10 days ago I was confined with such a love of a little girl, which I say is the image of Germain, he says it is exactly like me, and our dear mother says it is like us both. The fact is, it has beautiful blue eyes like Germain, and black curly hair like mine." "Good, worthy people, they deserve to be happy," said Rodolph. "If ever there was a couple well matched, it is they." "But really, monseigneur, I must ask your pardon for this chatter. Your ears must often tingle, monseigneur, for the day never passes that we do not talk of you, when we say to each other how happy we are, how happy we were, for then your name naturally occurs. Excuse this blot, monseigneur, but, without thinking of it, I had written M. Rodolph, as I used to say formerly, and then I scratched it out. I hope you will find my writing improved as well as my spelling, for Germain gives me lessons, and I do not make those long ugly scrawls I used to do when you mended my pens." "I must confess," said Rodolph, with a smile, "that my little protégé makes a mistake, and I am sure Germain is more frequently employed in kissing the hand of his scholar than in directing it."
"My dear duke, you are unjust," said Clémence, looking at the letter; "it is rather a very large hand, but very legible."
"Why, yes, she really has improved," observed Rodolph. "It would, in former days, have taken 8 pages to contain what she now writes in 2." And he continued: "It is quite true, you know, monseigneur, that you used to mend my pens, and when we think of it, we two Germains, we feel quite ashamed when we recollect how free from pride you were." "Ah, I am again chattering instead of saying what we wish to ask of you, monseigneur; for my husband unites with me, and it is very important, for we attach a great deal to it, as you will see. We entreat of you, monseigneur, to have the goodness to choose for us and give us a name for our dear little daughter. This has been the wish of the godfather and godmother, and who do you think they are, monseigneur? 2 persons whom you and the Marquise d'Harville have taken from misery and made very happy as we are. They are Morel the lapidary, and Jeanne Duport, a worthy creature whom I met in prison when I went there to visit my dear Germain, and whom the marquise afterwards took out of the hospital. And now, monseigneur, you must know why we have chosen M. Morel for godfather and Jeanne Duport for godmother. We said it would be the one way of again thanking M. Rodolph for all his kindness, to have, as godfather and godmother for our little one, worthy persons who owe everything to him and the marchioness; whilst, at the same time, Morel and Jeanne Duport are the worthiest people breathing, they are of our own class in life, and besides, as we say with Germain, they are our kinsfolk in happiness, for, like us, they are of the family of your protégés."
"Really, my dear father, this idea is most delightful and excellent," said Fleur de Marie, "to take for godfather and godmother persons who owe everything to you and my dear second mother."
"Yes, indeed, dearest," said Clémence,
"and I am deeply touched at their remembrance."
"And I am very happy to find that my favours have been so well bestowed," said Rodolph, continuing his letter. "With the money you gave him, Morel has now become a jewel broker, and earns enough to bring up his family very respectably. Poor Louise, who is a very good girl, is going, I believe, to be married to a very worthy young man, who loves and respects her as he ought to do, for she has been unfortunate, but not guilty, and Louise's husband, that is to be, is perfectly sensible of this." Rodolph laid great stress on these last words, looked at his daughter for a moment, and then continued: "I must add, monseigneur, that Jeanne Duport, through the generosity of the marquise, has been separated from her husband, that bad man who beat her and took everything from her. She has now her eldest daughter with her. They keep a small trimming shop, and are doing very well. Germain writes to you regularly, monseigneur, every month, on the subject of the bank for mechanics out of work and gratuitous loans. There are scarcely any sums in arrear, and we find already the good effects of it in this quarter. 9, at least, poor families can support themselves in the dead season of work without sending their clothes and bedding to the pawnbrokers. And when work comes in, it does one's heart good to see the haste with which they return the money lent, and they bless you for the loans so serviceably advanced. Yes, monseigneur, they bless you, for although you say you did nothing in this but appoint Germain, and that an unknown did this great benefit, we must always suppose it was you who founded it, as it appears to us the most natural idea. There is, besides, a most famous trumpet to repeat that it is you who are the real benefactor. This trumpet is Madame Pipelet, who repeats to every one that it could be no one but her king of lodgers (excuse her, M. Rodolph, but she always calls you so) who established such a charitable institution, and her old darling Alfred is of the same opinion. He is so proud and contented with his post as porter to the bank that he says all the tricks of M. Cabrion would not have the slightest effect on him now. Germain has read in the newspapers that Martial, a colonist of Algeria, has been mentioned with great praise for the courage he had shown in repulsing, at the head of the settlers, an attack of plundering Arabs, and that his wife, as intrepid as himself, had been slightly wounded by his side, where she handled her musket like a real grenadier. Since this time, says the newspaper, she has been called Madame Carabine. Excuse this long letter, monseigneur, but I think you will not be displeased to hear from us news of all those whose benefactor you have been. I write to you from the farm at Bouqueval, where we have been since the spring with our good mother. Germain leaves us in the morning for his business, and returns in the evening. In the autumn we shall return to Paris. It is so strange, M. Rodolph, that I, who could never endure the country, am now so fond of it. I suppose it is because Germain likes it so very much. As to the farm, M. Rodolph, you who know, no doubt, where the good little Goualeuse is, will perhaps tell her that we very often think of her as one of the dearest and gentlest creatures in the world, and that, for myself, I never think of my own happy condition without saying to myself, since M. Rodolph was also the M. Rodolph of dear Fleur de Marie, that, no doubt, she is by his kindness as happy as we are, and that makes one feel still more happy. Ah, how I chatter! What will you say to all this? But you are so good, and then, you know, it is your fault if I go on as long and as merrily as Papa Crétu and Ramonette, who no longer have a chance with me in singing. You will not refuse our request, will you, monseigneur? If you will give a name to our dear little child, it will seem to us that it will bring her good fortune, like a lucky star. If I conclude by saying to you, M. Rodolph, that we try to give every assistance in our power to the poor, it is not to boast, but that you may know that we do not keep to ourselves all the happiness you have given to us. Besides, we always say to those we succour, it is not us whom you should thank and bless, it is M. Rodolph, the best, most generous person in the world. Adieu, monseigneur, and pray believe that when our dear little child begins to lisp, the first word she shall utter will be your name, M. Rodolph, and the next those you wrote on the basket which contained your generous wedding presents to me. Labour and discretion, honour and happiness. Thanks to these 4 words, our love and our care, we hope, monseigneur, that our child will be always worthy to pronounce the name of him who has been our benefactor, and that of all the unfortunates he ever knew. Forgive me, monseigneur, but I cannot finish without the big tears in my eyes, but they are tears of happiness. Excuse all errors, if you please, it is not my fault, but I cannot see very clearly, and I scribble. I have the honour to be, monseigneur, your respectful and most grateful servant, Rigolette Germain. P.S. Ah, monseigneur, in reading my letter over again, I see I have often written M. Rodolph, but you will excuse me, for you know, monseigneur, that under any and every name we respect and bless you alike. Dear little Rigolette, said Clémence, affected by the letter, how full of good and right feeling is her letter! It is, indeed, replied Rodolph. She has an admirable disposition, her heart is all that is good; and our dear daughter appreciates her as we do," he added, addressing Fleur de Marie, when, struck by her pale countenance, he exclaimed, "But what ails you, dearest?" "Alas, what a painful contrast between my position and that of Rigolette! Labour and discretion, honour and happiness, these 4 words declare all that my life has been, all that it ought to have been. A young, industrious, and discreet girl, a beloved wife, a happy mother, an honoured woman, such is her destiny, whilst I " "What do you say?" "Forgive me, my dear father, do not accuse me of ingratitude; but in spite of your unspeakable tenderness and that of my second mother, in spite of the splendour with which I am surrounded, in spite of your sovereign power, my shame is incurable. Nothing can destroy the past. Forgive me, dear father. Until now I have concealed this from you, but the recollection of my original degradation drives me to despair, kills me." "Clémence, do you hear?" cried Rodolph, in extreme distress. "Oh, fatality, fatality! Now I curse my fears, my silence. This sad idea, so long and deeply rooted in her mind, has, unknown to us, made fearful ravages. It is too late to contend against this sad error. Oh, I am indeed wretched!" "Courage, my dearest!" said Clémence to Rodolph. "You said but now that it is best to know the enemy that threatens us. We know now the cause of our child's sorrow, and will triumph over it, because we shall have with us reason, justice, and our excessive love for her." "And then she will see, too, that her affliction, if it be indeed incurable, will render ours incurable," said Rodolph. After a protracted silence, during which Fleur de Marie appeared to recover herself, she took Rodolph's and Clémence's hands in her own, and said in a voice deeply affected: "Hear me, beloved father, and you, my best of mothers. God has willed it, and I thank him for it, that I should no longer conceal from you all that I feel. I must have done so shortly, and told you what I will now avow,
for I could not longer have kept it concealed."
"Ah, now I comprehend!" ejaculated Rodolph. "And there is no longer any hope for her?"
"I hope in the future, my dear father, and this hope gives me strength to speak thus to you."
"And what can you hope for the future, poor child, since your present fate only causes you grief and torment?"
"I will tell you; but before I do so let me recall to you the past, and confess before God, who hears me, what I have felt to this time."
"Speak, speak, we listen," was Rodolph's reply.
"As long as I was in Paris with you, my dearest father, I was so happy that such days of bliss cannot be paid for too dearly by years of suffering. You see, I have at least known happiness."
"For some days, perhaps."
"Yes, but what pure and unmingled happiness! The future dazzled me, a father to adore, a second mother to cherish doubly, for she replaced mine, whom I never knew. Then, for I will confess all, my pride was roused in spite of myself. So greatly did I rejoice in belonging to you. If then I sometimes thought vaguely of the past, it was to say to myself, 'I, formerly so debased, am the beloved daughter of a sovereign prince, whom everybody blesses and reveres. I, formerly so wretched, now enjoy all the splendours of luxury, and an existence almost royal. Alas! my father, my good fortune was so unlooked for, your power surrounded me with so much brilliancy that I was, perhaps, excusable in allowing myself to be thus blinded."
"Excusable? Nothing could be more natural, my angelic girl. What was there wrong in being proud of a rank which was your own, in enjoying the advantages of a position to which I had restored you? I remember at this time you were so delightfully gay, and said to me in accents I never can again hope to hear, 'Dearest father, this is too much happiness!' Unfortunately, it was these recollections that begat in me this deceitful security." End of Epilogue, Chapter 2, Part 1, read by Céline Major.